Technology is moving forward so fast that most of us, let's be honest, can't really keep up with it anymore. All these fancy new abbreviations are already confusing enough on their own. And considering that we're playing a game built on ancient Incan technology, where half of the modern GPU features simply aren't supported, digging into this whole fake frame topic doesn't exactly sound appealing either. The absolute majority of Rust players had no idea what the hell it was about. But among those who actually tried using it, about a third were satisfied with the results. So let's figure it out together. Who exactly this DLSS guy is, how it's different from DLAA, why Rust doesn't even have frame generation in the settings, which GPS can still enable it anyway, and why the hell we even need all of this in the first place. Enjoy the video. Alright, first let's untangle this mess of technologies, so we can understand what we can actually enable in Rust. The story of neural frames started back in September 2018, when NVIDIA introduced DLSS 1.0 to the world. DLSS stands for Deep Learning Supersampling, and it basically worked like this. Instead of rendering the game at a high resolution, the game rendered a simplified version of the frame at a lower resolution. Then DLSS 1.0 used neural networks to process that pixelated image and increase its resolution. Frame by frame, the image gets upscaled, and we end up with a much nicer looking picture almost for free, while also gaining extra FPS. However, the technology was extremely raw, and required deep training for each individual game. It ran on tensor cores, which first appeared in NVIDIA's RTX 20th series GPU. So DLSS was not only super raw, but you could also run it exclusively on the newest NVIDIA graphics cards at the time. About a year and a half later, in March 2020, DLSS 2.0 came out. In principle, it was the same idea, but the model became universal and worked across different games. A year later, AMD released their answer to DLSS and called it FSR, or Fidelity FX Super Resolution. Maximum Ultra Rampage Mega Edition. Basically, it was a simplified version of DLSS from that time. It didn't use neural networks or tensor cores at all, which meant you could enable it on almost any graphics card. The effect was similar to DLSS 2.0, just worse in terms of image quality. Then in May 2022, FSR 2.0 was released. This time, the upscaling also used data from previous frames, which brought the technology much closer to DLSS in terms of quality. It's supported on AMD GPUs starting from the 5000 series, and it can also run on most NVIDIA cards. But what happened next completely changed the game. In September 2022, NVIDIA released DLSS 3, adding a separate mechanism for frame generation. And now we're no longer talking about changing resolution to make the image sharper. We're talking about inserting artificial frames between real ones, which increases the overall smoothness of the image. DLSS 3rd generation worked only on RTX 40 series graphics cards and became the first mass-market frame gen. The confusion came from the fact that NVIDIA didn't separate frame generation into its own technology and instead made it part of DLSS. So now we have AI anti-aliasing that suddenly also includes frame generation, which has absolutely nothing to do with anti-aliasing in the first place. In short, it's basically like screwing a knife onto the back of a fork, but still calling the whole thing a fork. AMD didn't take long to respond to DLSS 3. In 2023, they introduced FSR 3.0 with its own frame generation. Even Intel joined the party with their own technology. But as sad as it sounds, none of the frame gens I just mentioned have ever worked in Rust.
Why?
The reason is that there's a kind of bridge between the game and our hardware that connects them together. And for frame generation, that bridge, meaning DirectX, needs to be updated to version 12. But Rust runs on DirectX 11, so yeah. Turns out I could have just not made this video. Or could I? You've probably noticed that the game settings actually have both DLSS and some other thing called DLAA. DLAA doesn't really interest us in this video at all, because it doesn't increase the frame rate in any way. It's just neural network anti-aliasing. DLSS is more interesting. It's also technically an anti-aliasing mechanism rather than full frame generation. But when you enable DLSS, the game starts rendering at a lower resolution and then upscales the image using neural networks. Naturally, that gives us a boost in FPS. Recent tests on the quality preset look like this. About plus 15% FPS basically out of nowhere. As for the image quality, it's actually pretty hard to notice any obvious artifacts in the game. But overall, you can see a bit of shimmering here and there. Sometimes the image gets slightly smeared or blurred. Basically, if someone has never played without DLSS before, they probably won't notice anything. But if you're used to playing without DLSS, it might feel a little unusual at first. Does that justify the extra 15% FPS? That depends on whether you actually need that boost, and whether you see yourself as some kind of hardcore combat machine. Personally, I don't. And in my opinion, playing with DLSS is perfectly fine if you're running 2K resolution or higher. But of course, I wouldn't make a whole video about frame generation if we didn't have other ways to squeeze out some extra FPS. The thing is, neural networks have learned not only to generate extra frames inside the game, but also outside of it. And for that, we don't need DirectX updates, developer support, or anything like that. Just a modern graphics card and a checkbox in the driver settings. NVIDIA calls their version smooth motion, AMD calls theirs fluid motion. But both of them are simply driver-level frame generation technologies based on interpolation. Interpolation basically means you take two values and calculate a middle value between them. And that's exactly what these technologies do. They take two frames, compare them, and insert a generated frame between them using neural networks. But it's important to understand that these generated frames have absolutely nothing to do with the game itself. Meaning if the game was running at, say, 100 frames per second, it's still running at 100. And another 100 frames just get drawn on top of that. So the tactile feeling of the game stays the same, even though visually the image becomes much smoother. Actually, not exactly the same, it can even get worse, because the technology itself also loads your GPU, which slightly reduces your native FPS. So I decided to run some tests on both technologies to see if it actually makes sense to enable them. First, let's take a look at smooth motion. To enable it, two conditions must be met. First, you need an NVIDIA 40 series GPU or newer. Second, HAGS must be enabled in your Windows settings. As for the recommended stuff, ideally you should be running Windows 11 and the latest driver version. Next, open the NVIDIA app, go to the Graphics tab, select Rust, and switch the required technology to on. First, I decided to test the frame generator on my main PC. I set the graphics preset in Rust Tweaker, launch Rust, load the benchmark demo, and record the FPS. When the demo finishes, I close the game, enable smooth motion, launch Rust again, and repeat the test. And this is the FPS picture we end up with. Initially, my setup delivered an average of 101 frames. Those are real frames, no neural magic involved. After enabling frame generation, I had to sacrifice about 20 real frames on average, but in return I gained around 80 generated ones. As a result, the average frame rate ended up at 160. That lets me play at native resolution with high settings, and hit my monitor's refresh rate limit, on a GPU that isn't even that powerful. But you and I both understand that the actual gameplay feeling here won't match what the graph shows. I'm not going to rely on subjective impressions for this. Instead, I grabbed a camera that shoots at 500 frames per second, and used some improvised methods to measure the input lag. I measured the time between the first captured frame of the right mouse button press and the moment the chat message updates. In terms of raw numbers, these values won't really mean much, but they work perfectly fine for comparing the results with each other. And to avoid misleading anyone, I won't be counting in milliseconds, but in frames, because the milliseconds in this case would differ a lot from the real ones. Before frame generation, the signal from my mouse reached the monitor in about 28 frames on average. After enabling the technology, the delay increased by 8 frames, or about 28%. Is that a noticeable difference in gameplay? Well, yeah, it is. If you're playing a platformer, a racing game, or something like The Witcher, that extra 30% of input lag will most likely go unnoticed. But in a game where shooting decides everything, dropping the responsiveness that much definitely doesn't feel great. So let's try to improve the situation a bit by lowering the graphics settings. Before this, we were testing everything on very high graphics. Now let's repeat the test using the performance preset. And to my surprise, the result ended up being exactly the same. Yes, obviously, on low settings, the FPS itself became much higher. But the effect of frame generation stayed roughly the same. About 57% increase in average FPS, which again means losing around 20% of the real frames. But let's remember that my setup is probably one of the worst possible scenarios for frame generation. I'm running an old Windows 10 build, and my GPU is already getting pretty old too. So let's repeat the test on a GTX 5070 Ti with Windows 11. The settings don't really matter here, the only important thing is that they stay the same in both tests. And here, the impact of frame generation looks completely different. A crazy 300 frames average frame rate, and about 75% improvement overall. That tells us that in exchange for nearly doubling the visual smoothness, we're sacrificing only about 11% of real performance. In this case, our native FPS will always stay above 100, which means input lag shouldn't really become a problem. But maybe some other problems will appear? Of course, I also compared the image quality before and after, and here are the strange things I noticed. The hardest thing for neural networks to reconstruct is thin, sharp objects. Things like UI elements, the crosshair, wires, light bulbs, and similar small details. Naturally, the lower your FPS is, the bigger the difference between neighboring frames becomes, and the higher the chance you'll see artifacts. At my normal frame rate, I could barely notice that during fast camera movement, the crosshair sometimes slightly doubled. On freeze frames during fast motion, you can also see that the image gets a bit smeared. But honestly, in actual gameplay, it's not just unnoticeable. It's actually hard to spot even if you're looking for it. I tried limiting the FPS to 30 to make these artifacts easier to see. And yeah, that worked. At 30 frames per second, the crosshair started behaving pretty weird. But what surprised me even more was something else. Those 30 frames per second duplicated to 60 actually felt much closer to 60 than to 30. I didn't feel any insane input lag, and visually the game still looked quite playable. I'm not drawing any conclusions yet though. First, let's see how things look on the AMD side. If you're the proud owner of an AMD 6000 series GPU or newer, just download the latest driver and look for the corresponding setting in Radeon software. I also tested this technology as best as I could, mainly by comparing FPS and looking for visual artifacts. As for the FPS, I couldn't really measure it properly. No program can correctly count the FPS after frame generation, except AMD's own tool. So in this case, the only real option is to test it yourself and rely on your own in-game impressions. And when it comes to artifacts, it was a bit harder for me to judge, because I didn't actually see the monitor live. I only had a gameplay recording. But even from that recording, I noticed that the artifacts from fluid motion seem a bit more noticeable. With NVIDIA, when calculating the intermediate frame, you sometimes get semi-transparent shadows from objects. But here the artifacts appear much more abruptly, even with motion blur enabled. The image itself also looked overly sharpened. And there's one more test I simply had to try. DLSS, together with smooth motion, enabled at the same time. Sounds promising on paper, but in practice it makes no sense. The FPS ends up being the same as without DLSS, while the image just becomes blurrier. Alright, theory and testing are behind us. Let's move on to the conclusions. For RTX GPU owners, there are 3 technologies you can actually use in Rust. DLAA makes object edges smoother in exchange for a few frames. DLSS can boost your FPS by roughly 15%, but the image will become slightly blurrier. Smooth motion steals around 10 to 20% of your real frames, and then doubles what's left. Along with a significant FPS boost, you may notice some minor artifacts that don't really interfere with gameplay, as well as a small loss in responsiveness. At the moment, it only works on RTX 40 and 50 series GPU, though support for older cards may appear in the future. If your GPU happens to glow bright red, then there's only one option, fluid motion. And if your graphics card is old, well, your only options are either to sit there angrily typing in the comments that all these technologies are complete garbage, or you can visit rusttweaker.com. This program helps everyone, whether you've got an RTX 4090 or a GT 730. Hope this video and the tests were useful for you. Thanks for watching.